Hello, sweet friends, and welcome back to the Quilter's Candy Shop, where you will find sweet treats for the discerning quilter. And welcome to week 2 of our Winter Garden Block of the Month. Today we're going to go over the background fabric for our blocks. There's a lot to cover today, so let's jump right in and start sewing something sweet. By the way, if you're new here, it's not too late to join our Block of the Month. After all, YouTube is free and there's no registration fee to join. The only requirement is the purchase of the pattern. We're following The Painter's Garden by Nancy Rink Designs. We have this in our shop for purchase at www.thequilterscandyshop.com. That's SHOPPE shop.com, and you can pick up this pattern for all the yardage requirements and the cutting instructions. And we also have kits available if you want to get started right away. Before we get to the actual cutting, I did want to point out that the pattern is written to accommodate a go cutter. There is a list of dies that you will need right here in the description in the pattern. The main set you will need is the Go Cube Mix and Match 8-inch block set. Everything else is pretty easy to cut with a rotary cutter, but there are dies available to cut the entire quilt top. You are in no way required to use a go cutter, but if you have one and would like to take advantage of the precision cutting, there are specific instructions for the go cutter throughout the pattern. There's also another list of supplies right here that they suggest. For example, you'll need a fabric marker of some kind. They recommend a 18.5-inch square ruler. I don't think you actually need that, but if you have one, it will be handy. And a few other items that are specific to the applique block squares. So look over the list and see if there's anything you may need. One of the things not on the list that I highly recommend is the So Handy sticker labels. These are cute little labels with letters and numbers to help you mark your pieces so you can stay organized. We do have these in our shop, and you can pick them up there, or you can buy them wherever you get your quilting supplies. Some of you have contacted me about using triangle paper, specialty rulers, or making your half skirt triangles and flying geese oversized and trimming down. There will be some opportunities for you to use half square triangle paper, like in these corner pieces here. And there is one flying geese set in every block in which you can use your favorite method. I'm pretty sure that the fabric requirements listed will accommodate any technique that you would like to use. But since there are so many different rulers and brands of paper aids, I can't guarantee it. So you may end up having to purchase a little bit more fabric to accommodate whatever technique you would like to use. And if you bought one of our kits and you need more fabric, just let me know and we'll work with you to figure out what you need. If you're going to be using any one of these specialty techniques to make your blocks, then do not cut out your background fabric prior to the blocks. You'll have to cut those out as you go. But if you're going to follow the pattern instructions as written, then go ahead and cut out all your background fabric, label them, and store them for future use. Now, let's talk about making the best use of your fabric. Blocks 1 through 5 use all the same background fabric for these outer bits of your pieced blocks and your applique blocks. To make construction more efficient and to ensure that you have enough background fabric, I recommend cutting all of your background pieces at one time and in advance of your block construction. And based on past experience, I suggest that you label the pieces and perhaps place them in Ziploc bags so they stay clean, organized, and ready to go. In the pattern, the pieces are listed from smallest to largest in the order of cutting, and this is very common in pattern writing. But I propose that you cut the largest first and then down to the smallest. This is more efficient in 2 different ways. Number 1, if you do run short of fabric, then you will end up buying the smallest amount necessary to get your blocks done. For example, In the pattern, the last cut they have you make is a 19-inch strip width of fabric. And if you didn't have enough to make that cut, you would have to go buy a half a yard of fabric in order to get that done. But if you started with the largest ones and you got down and you didn't have quite enough to make the 3-inch cuts, then you would only have to buy an eighth of a yard of fabric to get your project completed. And number 2, there is far less waste when you cut your larger pieces first, because you can make better use of your fabric. For example, I suggest that you make the 19-inch cut first. The instructions call for you to make a 19-inch cut width of fabric, and then you cross-cut 18 1 3/4 inch strips along that 19-inch width. That leaves you a 10-inch piece at the bottom of your strip. That's 10 inches by 19 inches. That's a sizable piece of fabric. If that was the last thing you cut, that nice piece of fabric would end up in the scrap pile. But if you cut the larger first, when you get down to the end, that 19-inch by 10-inch piece will accommodate more of the other pieces that are required for the background, thus making much better use of your fabric and eliminating wasteful scraps. Now, let's cut some fabric. If you are making the quilt with the pieced centers, then you're going to follow the instructions for cutting out the background that says pieced version. If you're making the quilt with the applique block centers, then you're going to follow the cutting instructions for the applique version. I'll be going over some of the details of cutting today so that you can apply this cutting strategy to some of your other fabrics when we get to constructing the blocks. All right, for clarity, if you feel like you're a good cutter and you don't need any tips on cutting out your background and you can just follow the directions, then you can stop the video here, because all we're going to do is do a little bit of cutting on the backgrounds and following the pattern. But if you'd like a little help, little insight, then just keep watching. First of all, the background required is about 2.5 yards. And for most people, you don't have 2.5 yards worth of space to work. So what I like to do is I usually go and cut off a yard. So it's easier to work with. You can fold it. You can make sure it's straight. It's just a lot easier to work with. And I find there's always plenty of fabric. 1 yard usually does it. And then I like to fold it so my selvage edge is close to me and as best as lined up along the folded edge as possible. And get that all straightened out. All right, and these are my go-to rulers. A 12.5-inch square and a 6 or 6.5-inch square, a 6 by 14 rectangle, and always a great one just to have on hand is a 3 or 4-inch wide by 14 or 18. This one's 18. So these are, if you have these 4 rulers, you can do pretty much anything. But you don't have to have these exact ones. You can use whatever you have. In your pattern, if you open to page 2, right here, this is your block background fabric cutting instructions. The first section is for the pieced version. The second section is for the applique version. And the first couple of cuts are exactly the same, so we are going to do those together. As I mentioned previously, we are going to cut in reverse. We're going to cut the largest pieces first. And so we're going to start by squaring up the end. Now, if you take your square and line up a line across your folded edge right here, the longer this is right here, the more square it's going to be. So that's why I like to use a nice big square to get started. And then use a ruler off to the side. If you make a good first cut, everything else is going to go beautiful. So to make this cut, put down the square nice and lined up, perfectly perpendicular. Put a second ruler here, slide this one away, and cut. And you will have a perfect starter cut. You've probably seen me do this technique before, and it really works great. Okay, the first cut, if we're going from the bottom up, is one 19-inch width of fabric strip. So width of fabric means from selvage to selvage. And I only have a 12.5-inch ruler here. So in order to make an 19-inch cut, I have to add more ruler. So that's where these extra rulers come in to play. I'm going to add this 6-inch and this 3-inch. That's more than I need, but it makes it easy for me to, I can just do the math. So if I've got 6 and 3 is 9, and I need a 19-inch, then I know I just need 10 inches on this side. So here's the 10-inch line. Slide it down here. Now, keep in mind, if one of these rulers is, if this was, let's say, a 6.5-inch, you'd have to accommodate for that 1/2 inch. But this is a 3-inch, and a 6-inch is 9 plus 10 is going to give me 19 inches. So I'm going to put the 10-inch right on the mark. I'm also going to do a good job lining up the bottom again. But if you made a good cut here, you can put your 10-inch mark on this line, and if everything's nice and tight, you should be able to make a cut here and it'll be perfect. So I'm going to make this cut just like this. I'm going to slide my extra off to the side here. So the next part of the instruction is to cut 1 3/4 strips out of this 19-inch wide. And as you can see, this is wider than my board. So I am going to take and rotate this board so that I have a good cutting board underneath all my fabric. So just like that, boom, I've got plenty of cutting space. And of course, just for this one cut, we need a slightly larger ruler to get all the way across the fabric. So I'm breaking out my 6.5 by 24. This is another must-have ruler. Sometimes you don't use it a lot, but when you need it, it's good to have. So we're going to do the same thing as before. We're going to get a good first cut, and we're going to cut from the selvage edge side. We want to leave the folded edge because that's going to be leftover fabric we're going to use for something else. So starting on the selvage edge side, we're going to use the square to get lined up along this cut edge. So make sure this is good all along this bottom cut right here. And then we're going to use this ruler to cut all the way across. So just slide that out of the way. And there we go. Now the instructions call for 18 1 3/4 inch strips. 1 3/4 inch. And I'm going to make sure that that's nice and straight by using my square again. So 1 3/4. And by starting on the selvage side, we cut 2 layers at once. So I'm just going to leave those right there. So do it again, 1 3/4. And get this line lined up because we want a good measure. And then we use this to make sure it is good and square. Perfect. So there's 2 and 4. This will be 6. One 1 3/4. And you just continue this until you get all 18. 19. And 18. And now look, we have this really nice big piece of fabric left over. And if we had cut this last, this piece would have been left over to go in the scrap pile. But as we're cutting it first, we can now use this to cut some of the smaller pieces that are required for the pattern. We interrupt this program for an apology and a correction. For some reason, I got the words width of strip stuck in my head. I'm so sorry, that is confusing. I always mean width of fabric. WOF means width of fabric, and that's the same thing as selvage to selvage. So please accept my apology, and we'll continue on. Now, technically, the next cut is the 17-inch wide width of strip. But since we have this, we're going to figure out what's going to be best use of this fabric. And if you look at the instructions, it calls for 2 5¼ width of strips recut into 9 5¼ inch squares. The reason you have to have 2 width of strips is because you can't get 9 out of 1 width of strip. You have to have 1 more block. So that's another waste of fabric. So if you use this fabric to cut this 5¼ inch square out of it, then you will only have to cut 1 5¼ inch width of strip. So we're going to do that. I'm going to take my square here, and I'm going to come right down in this corner and do 5 1/4. So I'm going to use my square lines I've already got cut here, and I'm just going to cut out this 1 5¼ nice and carefully. You don't want to overcut because we're going to be cutting more things out of this. So just like that. And this is going to be one of the G triangles, but for now I'm just going to leave it a square. So I'm going to put that up here out of the way, and we're going to put more squares in here. Okay, so once that piece is cut, we still have all of this space. And if you look further down in the instructions, we need to cut 10 2 7/8 inch width of strips in order to get 126 2 7/8 inch squares. Well, we can get over 12 squares out of this piece right here. So we're going to do that, and then we will not have to cut so many width of strips fabrics from our larger piece. So I'm going to use my long and lean ruler, and I'm going to cut. Now, some of you who like to cut large and trim down, where this piece is going, it's going to be a triangle, and it's going to be on a phalange, on an edge in the pattern. So it's not really something you can trim down. So please go ahead and cut this one at the right size of 2 7/8, because even though 1/8 of an inch doesn't seem like very much, this is going to get cut on the diagonal, and that actually turns into almost 3/8 of an inch. So it does make extra large triangles, and it's very difficult to trim down. So I recommend cutting this. You can cut it 3 inch if you want, and then try and trim down your triangles, because I did actually do that the first block I made. I did that and I regretted it, but you know, it's up to you however you feel comfortable doing it. But I'm going to recommend that you cut this right at 2 7/8. Now this one, you can see I need my longer ruler, because I'm going to do that. And this one here, 2 7/8, 2 7/8. And then this is not enough to make 2 7/8, and I don't think it's enough for 2 1/2. No, not quite. So this is all that's left now. That's waste. So these I will take and layer this. I'm going to cut 3 of these. This is where a little small square comes in handy. So make sure these are all lined up. I'm going to put my square along my edge here. Take my cutting ruler on the edge. Perfectly perpendicular cut to start. Now I can just go down here at 2 7/8 and finish the squares. Making your cut. Okay, and now these are scraps. Take that off. Scrap pile up there, and I can get a couple more out of this leftover. And scrap. So I actually got 3, 6, 9, 12, 13, 14 of these B squares, and I can subtract those from my 126, and you can use your labels that have numbers on them and put it right on top of here. Put a B and then 14. Then you know how many you have. You don't have to keep recounting it. Okay, let's go on to the 17-inch cut. It's going to be exactly the same. Okay, here's my leftover piece from my original cut. I'm going to use, even though I know this is straight because I cut it before, we've moved it around, it's always good to start with a new fresh cut. So I'm going to put this right on here again, 12-inch ruler. To make sure this is square along the bottom, I'm going to take my little handy cutting skinny ruler, and I did a good job. That was good and straight, but there we go. Now we know for sure it's perfect. And I have to get 17 inches. So I need my 6-inch ruler and my 3-inch ruler. That's 9, but I only need 17 this time. So instead of measuring at 10, I'm going to be measuring at 8 inches. So here's my 8-inch line. I'm going to line that right up on that edge. And now make sure I have a straight line all the way across the length of my fabric. So I have a good straight cut, just like that. Perfect. And now I'm going to cut on this side. So 3 plus 6 is 9, plus 8 is 17. Excellent. Now the same thing, I already have my mat turned. We're going to do the exact same thing here. And we are going to cut 18 1 3/4 inch strips, just like before. I'm going to use my square to square up my edge. And remember, we're cutting off the selvage edge first. Bring this all the way down. Line up this. Make sure this is where I want it to cut. And trim off the selvage. 1 3/4. And make sure it's square. Perfect. And continue on until we have 18 of these strips. Okay, and 1 3/4. Make sure it's straight along there. It looks good. And that is 18. And again, we have this nice big piece left over. So now we can cut more of those 2 7/8 inch pieces. And because this is only 17 inches, I can use my 3 by 18-inch ruler and line that up at 2 7/8. You might be asking, why don't you cut another one of those 5 1/4? Well, the 5 1/4 will come out perfectly on the width of the fabric for 8 of them. So we're going to make a better use of this by getting a few more of these 2 7/8 inch jobbies. Now this one, we have a little left over here, and this one looks like I can get 2 1/2 because the last piece to cut is the 2 1/2 width of strip and then cut into 36 2 1/2 inch squares. So I can take this last little bit, 2 1/2, and this is where marking your pieces is really going to come in handy, because look at this, the difference between this and this is really not that much. And if you pick up the wrong piece and cut it on the diagonal, you will cry. So marking your pieces is really important. So this is the 2 1/2. I'm going to lay these out here, and we're going to finish cutting the 2 7/8. Okay, and here is the results from those 3 strips of 2 7/8. So there's 3, 6, 9, 12, and 15. And there's this little bit left that will not make a 2 7/8, but it will make a 2 1/2 just perfectly. So I'm going to cut a 2 1/2 stack of squares right there, and that gives me 3 of these to go in with the rest. So let me show you what we've got so far. We've got 18 of our I strips that are 19 inches long. We've got 18 of our H strips that are 17 inches long. Remember, we cut one of the 5 1/4 inch squares, that's G. We've got 14 of our B squares that we cut from the extra of the 19-inch strip. And now we're going to take this 15 and put it with this 14, and that's going to make 29 B squares. Now, unfortunately, the numbers don't go all the way up to 29, but I've worked out a little plan. You can just take a 2 and a 9, and now I know I have got 29 in here, and I don't have to keep recounting for my brain. And don't forget, we've got 3 more now of these little 2 1/2 inch A squares, so I'm going to add this to the pile. And that's 3 more to 6. I'm just going to flip this 6 around. Now it's a 9. Good enough. All right. I love these design boards. They keep everything organized and easy to handle. And when I need them, they're within reach because I can bring them right to me. Or when I need them out of my way, I can just set them aside. All right, well, let's continue. You have probably guessed that our next cut is going to be the 5 1/4 inch width of fabric. So we need to cut a strip 5 1/4. And of course, we start by squaring up the end. Now I can go to 5 1/4. Make sure this is lined up at the bottom. And cut my strip. I'm going to set aside my leftover fabric. I'm going to break out my square and line up along here on that cut edge, nice and straight, so I get a good perpendicular first cut. Cutting 8 of these 5 1/4 inch squares is going to take up all the fabric in this piece, so you will want to make sure you come as close to the selvage as possible without including any of the bad parts of the selvage. Just like that. All right. And now 5 1/4, and I need 8. We need 9, but I've already cut the 1, so this is 2, 4, 6, and 8. And here again is the perfect example of how cutting your largest pieces first makes better use of your fabric. Because had we done this before the largest pieces, we would have had to cut 2 5 1/4 inch strips with the fabric, and the second strip would only have 1 square cut from it. Fortunately, we were able to cut that G square from another piece of fabric, and now we have everything we need. Cutting the rest of the background is pretty self-explanatory, and you can follow the pattern for the rest of the pieces. Just remember that you already have a few A and B squares cut, so deduct them from the total number of pieces that you need to cut. For those of you doing the applique version, there's just one difference, and that is the need to cut the 8 1/2 inch squares that are the background for the applique. When you follow the cutting instructions for the applique version, you're going to cut your 19 inch, your 17 inch, and then you're going to go ahead and cut your 8 1/2. Use the same cutting strategy as described for the piece version and cut 1 O 8 1/2 inch square from the leftover fabric of the 19 inch cut, and cut 1 5 1/4 inch square from the 17 inch cut. And then use the rest of the leftover fabric to get as many A and or B squares as you can before moving on to cutting the rest of your background. Well, that's it for today. I hope you can see the usefulness of this cutting strategy. You will be able to apply this again in this pattern, but now you can also apply it to more of the quilt patterns you will make in the future. Okay, so that's it. Get your backgrounds cut, labeled, and ready to go, and we will start constructing our blocks in the next episode of the Winter's Garden Block of the Month. Bye!